Okay, morning Year 13. I'm going to be talking about The Handmaid's Tale, and we're going to concentrate on dystopian fiction, and in particular on the work of George Orwell. Okay, as we know, the idea of utopia is the idea of a perfect society. It comes from Thomas More, an English philosopher and theologian, and he wrote a book called Utopia based on that very idea of a perfect society. Far more important today is this idea of dystopia, the idea that society is actually deteriorating, that things are getting far worse. And at the moment, I think that we see this all the time, whether it's The Walking Dead and the world becoming a zombified place, or whether it's like The Road, in which the world is destroyed by economic and environmental catastrophe, or whether it's something to do with environmental factors like the hurricane we've just seen in America. It seems to me to be an incredibly popular genre. Now, Margaret Atwood is very interested in this. She describes herself as a writer of speculative fiction. She hates the term science fiction. She says, as a woman writer in particular, she has no interest in science and science fiction. She's far more interested in this idea of speculative fiction, of what could happen. Now, another thing that Margaret Atwood says, and this is her boast, that nothing in her fiction is fiction. Every single thing that she writes about in her books actually has happened in the past or is happening now. So, for instance, you may have seen that in The Handmaid's Tale, gay people are beaten to death and hung from the wall. Many of you will know that in Iran, people are hung from cranes and kicked to death by crowds. The idea of partisecution, the idea that the crowd will tear somebody apart and kill them, seems to, in some ways, to be a crazy science fiction idea. In fact, once again, as I just explained, in Iran, that's something which is actually practiced. So I'm going to move on now to George Orwell, who was her great hero. Now, Orwell wrote two famous books that you need to know about. The first is Animal Farm, which is a political satire against communism. And the second one, the really important one, is 1984, which he wrote in 1948. And this is a book I'm going to compare to The Handmaid's Tale in many different ways for you. This is a quote from Margaret Atwood. Orwell became a direct model for me much later in my life, in the real 1984, the year in which I began writing a somewhat different dystopia, The Handmaid's Tale. Interesting, isn't it, that she chose 1984 to write this particular book? Now, in this PowerPoint, I'm including a link to this Guardian article, which talks about Margaret Atwood's, the influence of George Orwell and Margaret Atwood. Great article, I think you'll really enjoy it. Orwell himself is a fascinating guy, guys. His name isn't actually George Orwell, it's Eric Blair, okay? He was born in India, and he grew up as a colonial child, and he went to school in Eton. But he decided to turn against the wealthy establishment, and he became a socialist. He went to fight in the Spanish Civil War, where he was wounded, and during this time he actually developed a hatred for communism. So he was very like me. I used to be a very strong socialist when I was young, and I moved away from it when I saw the more negative effects, the more totalitarian effects of socialism. Now, dictators such as Adolf Hitler in Germany and Joseph Stalin inspired Orwell's hatred of totalitarianism. So Hitler's extreme right-wing, a fascist, and Stalin was extreme left-wing, a communist. But both of them were incredibly brutal, and 1984 attacks both systems of government. Joseph Stalin was probably Orwell's main inspiration for Big Brother. I think many of you know. Have you ever seen this poster before, Big Brother is watching you, or the reference to Big Brother? This term, Big Brother, comes from 1984. The dictator of Oceania in 1984 is a chap like this, very like Joseph Stalin, with a big moustache. He's referred to as Big Brother. Now, of course, if we think about the connotations of brotherliness and kindness and friendship and amiability, they are not what we're going to see in the poster. Now, throughout the Soviet Union, posters of Stalin were absolutely everywhere. And in 1984, posters of Big Brother are everywhere. They're universal. Now, I'm sure you realize that at the end of the Second World War, and this is important for you, Mosh, in particular as a politics student, you will know that the world divided into two main blocks. The Soviet bloc and what we could call the free world, okay? Now, likewise, in 1984, the world is divided into different camps: Oceania, Eurasia, East Asia, and the disputed territories. And they are in a state of permanent war. And permanent war suits them because it makes everyone paranoid, and it means you can have martial law. So if you want any democracy or free speech, you get shot because you are in a state of war. Also, another thing that I think you're going to recognize very much is the idea that there is a very set social hierarchy. In 1984, it's meant to be a communist society of equality, but it's far from it. At the bottom, you have the proles, the proletariat, the workers, don't you? Then you have the outer party, and at the top, you have the inner party with Big Brother as the autocrat. Likewise, in The Handmaid's Tale, you have the unwoman, don't you, and the people in the colonies. Then you have the Marthas, who are the kind of slaves in the kitchen, aren't they? You have econo wives, don't you? You have drivers, you have commanders, you have aunts. All of them have a set place within the social hierarchy, don't they? Now, 1984 was published in 1949, and as I said, it was all about Oceania, and it concerns this guy, Winston Smith. He's called Winston Smith because he's meant to be an ordinary guy, and that's what he is in the book, okay? Winston, during the course of the novel, realizes that the society that he's in is a terrible society, and he commits this crime, which we call thought crime. And much of the book revolves around the love affair that he has with Julia, who is also a person who hates the party, okay? Now, what I'm going to say as well, I'm going to go through a couple of these slides and get to the really interesting bit, okay, is just like in The Handmaid's Tale, in 1984, sexuality and romance are seen as evil. And instead, you have to show your loyalty to Big Brother and to the idea of government, etc. Now, I said before that Joseph Stalin was a huge influence. Also, of course, Hitler and Mein Kampf were a big influence to him as well. And I wanted to show you a couple of slides which I think are really interesting. In The Handmaid's Tale, there are a lot of displays of power, aren't there? Where the handmaids have to line up and they have to do various things and watch things. In particular, you will remember the particution, which is where you actually take part in the execution of a political prisoner. Now, much of this is taken from Hitler in particular, who did these set pieces, didn't he, of power. And now, I don't know how many of you realize that Hitler in particular was obsessed by Rome, and obsessed by the idea of being like a Roman emperor and to show his power. Now, what's interesting about in The Handmaid's Tale is that there is no political leader, obvious political leader. They're all sort of shadowy nobodies, aren't they? So in that sense, it's very different from Hitler, isn't it? Who was this kind of focused individual. We don't really see the leadership so much in Gilead. We meet the commander, but he doesn't seem like a personality cult kind of figure, does he? Going to move on a little bit here. Now, young people are very, very important in autocratic societies quite often, okay? In Russia, you had the young pioneers or the komsomols, okay? When I visited Cambodia, for instance, it shocked me. I was not that much older than you. I was only 19 when I went there. That the Khmer Rouge, the people who murdered over 3 million, most of them were only teenagers, 13 or 14 years old. And Matthew Lamb, who's sitting in front of us now, would have been killed because wearing spectacles was one of the crimes in Cambodia. It was seen as evidence that you thought you were scholarly and above other people. So that was enough to get you killed by the 13-year-olds. Now, in The Handmaid's Tale, however, youth is not so important. Hitler loved the whole idea of youth as well. He understood that young minds were the ones that you could indoctrinate most. But the problem, of course, in The Handmaid's Tale is that nobody is having babies. Why not? Because reproduction has been destroyed. It's been destroyed by environmental catastrophe, but it's also been destroyed by sexually transmitted diseases, or so the right-wing conservative Christians say. And these ideas basically mean that they cannot have a kind of youth movement in The Handmaid's Tale because there aren't enough youth. And The Handmaid's Tale is a story partly of child theft, isn't it? It's the story of thieving other people's children and bringing them into your indoctrinated world. But it's also the story of kidnapping a woman's womb and taking a prisoner and using a woman as a baby factory for the people that you want. So it's a really sinister and horrible story. Now moving on to the theme of surveillance and control. This is absolutely enormous. In 1984, and we'll be looking at an extract, you will see this is a telly screen. And Orwell was a genius. He actually looked at internet technology. He seemed to see it and predict it. Because the telly screen you've got to watch all day, and it gives you all the political propaganda of Big Brother. But there's another thing that telly screen does. It watches you. So your entire life is recorded from the moment you wake up. And I want you to see the parallels with Handmaid's Tale, because the eyes are the secret agents in Gilead who watch everybody all of the time. You'll recall every time Offred has a conversation with someone, she's paranoid that they might be an eye. So this theme of surveillance is a huge one. And another theme is the idea of controlling language. In 1984, there's something called Newspeak, which is designed by the Ministry of Truth. And Newspeak is a way of controlling language so that they can control thought. Now, of course, that's very much the same in The Handmaid's Tale. When women meet each other, the handmaids meet each other, you may recall they say, "Blessed be the fruit." Do you remember that? So they have to speak in these cliches of the state of Gilead. So this theme of controlling language is going to be extremely important. And now I'm going to stop on this last slide over here, because if you have a quick look at the themes here, I think you may recognize some of them. Okay, we're back to recording now, okay? And I'll have a tiny bit of feedback from you. The deprivation of privacy, is that a big theme for us? Extremely so, isn't it? Offred has virtually no privacy, although she does actually have the ability to retreat to a private room and be alone with her memories, which is more than Winston Smith can do in 1984 because there's a telly screen there. One of the things I hope that you picked up on is The Handmaid's Tale is not a high-tech society. It's an old-fashioned society going back in time, isn't it, to a kind of almost 1950s America. What about the prohibition of sex? Is that a big theme? Once again, it seems to me to be in this kind of Christian fundamentalist world, sex for fun, for joy, for romance is seen as a terrible thing. And sex is purely for procreation, isn't it? The ceremony is set up so there can be no pleasure or joy in sex whatsoever. So you'll recall that Offred has to sit between Serena's knees as the commander has sex with her. Designed, isn't it, to take any joy whatsoever out of the act itself. The destruction of history, a very big theme. Gilead and the society in The Handmaid's Tale wants to wipe out previous history, doesn't it? It's why they don't like Offred's generation that much, because they've been educated in the old world. They're looking to Offred's daughter's generation to be the true citizens of Gilead, because they won't know anything different. The essential nature of memory is a huge theme, isn't it? Both in 1984 and in A Handmaid's Tale. Handmaid's Tale, so much of A Handmaid's Tale is Offred's memories. Her memories of her daughter, her memories of Luke, her memories of her job. That's her refuge. It's the kind of womb to which she retreats. when she's at her lowest. An appreciation of the past, well, I'll put that in the same kind of category as the destruction of history. And the ultimate fallibility of the human mind, the idea that we can't beat the system when the system's so strong. One of the big arguments we're going to have, I should say not arguments but discussions, will be, is Handmaid's Tale a bleak dystopian book, or is it the story of resistance? Is it a successful story of resistance? And I think it makes a really interesting debate as we go through the novel. And finally, this idea of education and the control of thought is really important. Why is it that Offred plays Scrabble with the commander? And I think the conclusion you've got to come to is because language is so important. She deliciously enjoys putting words together, because one of the projects of Gilead is to take words and language away, especially from women. Like the Taliban, they see female literacy as evil. And that's quite a shocking thing, isn't it? And finally, as I said, sex is seen as an unpleasant act, solely for reproduction, in both societies. So whether it's kind of dictatorship 1984, Oceania, or whether it's Gilead, in both societies, sex and romance, and don't forget, our overarching theme is love. Love is seen as dangerous within dictatorship. It's seen as a refuge, isn't it? As distracting you from power and from those that they want you to give your attention to. Beautiful poster here from 1984, from the original film made in the 50s. So I'm hoping that today you saw some of the connections between 1984 and between Handmaid's Tale. It was definitely the case that Margaret Atwood was very influenced by George Orwell. However, there are also going to be a lot of differences, and we need to explore those. So for the idea of AO4 and typicality, it's really essential that you look at dystopian fiction, you look at the genre, you look how Margaret Atwood works both within and against the genre. That's all.